extraordinary. Let me first say that I want to thank my good friend and brother Chris Terrace for bringing us together. This is so very important, and he himself just recently admitted that Harvard and Chicago at graduate school, which means the younger generation is also on the move. In this case, Rich Chicano, brother, so good to see it. And similarly so for my good friend and sister, Professor Doris Sommer, of course, not only distinguished critic, but also intellectual freedom fighter. And I am always inspired and instructed anytime I am in the presence of my good friend and brother and colleague and comrade, Davíd Carrasco. There's nothing like him in the academy, in which he's able to bring together such intellectual sophistication on the one hand, wise insight on the other, and is so alive and vital and vibrant because he existentially enacts the intellectual sophistication that he puts forward, and that's a rare thing in the academy. And so I'm both blessed as well as honored and privileged to respond very briefly to him and then to open it up for dialogue. And let me begin by saying, just in looking at not simply the numbers and quantity of persons here, but the quality of your commitment to this dialogue, reflected in you sitting on the edges of your seats. And Professor Carrasco's and Brother David's such powerful and extraordinary presentation that it's fair to say that it is a new day at Harvard, especially in relation to brown brothers and sisters. It's a new day. And anytime it's a new day, it means that there's going to be some formidable challenges. How do you build on the best of the Harvard tradition that has this allegiance to this audacious motto of veritas, of truth? We know about the worst of that tradition, but building on the best of it, acknowledging that truth itself, of course, is a non-market value, also acknowledging that it's a terrifying and horrifying value for those who take it seriously. Truthful about ourselves, truthful about Americans, U.S., Latin America, Central America, truthful about modernity, truthful about the world. These are horrors and terrors that create a cosmic shudder, an existential shiver, as it were. And that's why black-brown dialogue is fundamentally about trying to redefine for the world what it means to engage in the quest for truth, what it means to define what it means to be human, and so on. And I'm so very glad that Brother David began with linking this dialogue to friendship and to citizenship. And it's very important because friendship and citizenship is a way of transforming the energy of kinship. We're all born in certain kinship networks. And what it means to engage in a quest for truth, to burst out of parochial shells and provincial contexts, is to transform that energy that allows us to move from womb to tomb into something like friendship and citizenship, which is a form of allegiance that is higher than and therefore broader and deeper than simply that rich kinship that cared and nurtured for us and made us in part who we are before we had the capacity to choose with whom we would work with, fall in love with, organize with, cooperate with, coagulate with, and what have you. But this friendship, this amistad, this critical friendship is predicated on trust, bonds of trust, and there can be no dialogue, especially black-brown. I say especially black-brown because when you have two groups of people who have caught so much unnecessary hell under modern conditions, they tend to be a bit paranoid. And the question becomes, can you really trust them? Is the friendship real? Is it substantive? I'm not here to engage in chit-chat. I'm not here to engage in some kind of narrow, truncated academic exchange. We want dialogue. And dialogue means I have to take a risk. I have to be vulnerable. I want to be able to see whether I can reach out to the edge, step out on the margins of life's abyss, and somebody will be there just in case I make a fool of myself. Black-brown dialogue has to be predicated in some sense on bonds of trust that allow us to take that risk and to be vulnerable and to wrestle with precisely the kind of tensions and frictions, the lies that we've told about each other, the hallowed idols that we've often worshiped, and the sugar-coated pieties that we often trot out as a way of constituting, supposedly, an exchange, but simply hiding and concealing our distrust. And one of the things I treasure and cherish in Brother Davíd is that in the deepest sense, he is a brother. That is to say, there's deep bonds of trust, which frees him up and frees me up. Say what we want and even make a fool of ourselves, but we know that we're there at each other's back, as it were. But that's the freedom that's necessary. And that freedom of the soul and freedom of the mind is the prefiguration of the freedom that we're fighting for brothers and sisters who are still catching hell in jails, in barrios, in ghettos, on farms, be they picking strawberries, as we saw with Brother Felipe just last week, or be they in industrial units in chocolate cities like Detroit for multinational corporations like GM. That's where this notion of citizenship is so linked to friendship. Citizenship is a democratic discourse, and that wonderful language of linking demographics to democracy is so crucial. Because when we're talking about black and brown dialogue, it is in no way confined to the interests of Latinos and Latinas and Latinos, and people of African descent. We're talking about the future of democracies, of American democracies, the prospects of democratic republics, the dominant forces on the globe, market forces, profit-driven, the forces of Macworld, as Benjamin Barber puts it, McDonald's, the Macintosh, the Microsoft, ... And it cuts across the grain. And if there's no democratic forces that constitute countervailing forces against those market forces, then all the black and brown dialogue in the world could easily become but sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. Is it rooted in those realities, structural and institutional as well as existential and personal, that's shaping the globe? The second increasing, ascending force is group consciousness, clan consciousness, groups feeling so put upon that it's difficult to forge the kind of bonds of trust that constitute the foundation for alliances and coalitions that are democratic, radically democratic, trying to curtail the power of multinational corporate entities, trying to ensure that everyday people across race have some voice in the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives. And that's why to talk about black and brown has to be cast in a very delicate way. We recognize on the one hand people of African descent in all of their complexity and heterogeneity, multiplicity and complexity, diversity as well. Never one people, but often viewed as one people through white supremacist lens, and brown peoples with all of their diversity all of their multiplicity. What is it now, about 13.7 or 8 brothers and sisters of Mexican descent, and about 2.7 of Puerto Rican descent, or Puerto Ricans in the States or on the island, about 1.6 million Cuban brothers and sisters, hundreds of thousands of other Spanish-speaking from El Salvador and Uruguay and other places. It's a lot of diversity. When we talk about brown, it's not a monolithic construct by no means. But it's so easy to become locked into an inward, insular, isolated group consciousness just for the purpose of group survival, which runs into a dead end and cul-de-sac to think that somehow we will survive as groups in the face of the global market forces. And this is why democratic ideals, radical democratic ideals, are so very important. Black people will never be free, never have voices that would help shape their destinies by organizing solely and exclusively by themselves, or associating solely and exclusively by themselves, and similarly so for brown brothers and sisters. The inward-looking, the isolated, insular perspective is such that it simply weakens and renders more feeble democratic forces in the face of market forces. And yet we also know that group consciousness is real. It is inescapable. In some sense, it is indispensable. How then do we cast it in such a way that it becomes not simply a matter of narrow kinship and groupship, but facilitates friendship and notions of citizenship in the face of growing wealth inequality, class inequality, linked to oftentimes the kind of machismo that Professor Carrasco was talking about, you see, since it's primarily brothers of some sort who at the moment are in the driver's seat of this global capitalist economy, and disproportionately beneficiaries of it. You see, that for me is the fundamental question. The black-white divide has never been sufficient to capture the depths of the realities of race in the United States. Never. And this idea that, brown voices are new voices, this idea that with brown and yellow and red we have new interventions, is simply some bureaucrat's construct, because the voices have always been there. They simply have not been taken seriously. They've been rendered invisible. How could you talk about Harvard Law School and not talk about Pedro Albizu Campos? How could you talk about Harvard and not talk about Du Bois? It's always been there, just pushed to the margins, that's all. Pushed to the margins. And yet, and I have to admit this because I've in some way been complicitous in this regard, so many of the recent discourses on race, the preoccupation has been the relation of the vicious legacy of white supremacy to people of African descent. That's certainly the case in Race Matters. About 97% of the text talks about how black folk catching hell, what we can do about it. You see certain references, brown and yellow and red and so forth and so on, but it's just gestures. Gestures, and I think I deserve some serious criticism for that. But the crucial focus is this, that it's not black-white. We begin with understanding the legacy of white supremacy and how it ricochets vis-a-vis persons across the board. So that black, brown oftentimes view each other through white supremacist lens. Well, where do those lenses come from? Go over into the barrio and say, yeah, those black folk are. Go over in the black community, yeah, you know how the Latinos are. Where'd they get those constructs? Go down to Cuba in the early 20th century and see segregated patterns modeled after the American South. Where did that come from? U.S. imperial imposition. And it's not a matter of demonizing, it's simply a matter of telling the truth about the ways in which this legacy oftentimes blinds black and brown in seeing the best as well as the worst of our own histories. And we have to be honest about that. And I think there's nothing wrong, in fact, with talking about the relation of the legacy of white supremacy to particular groups. We just have to keep in mind that we're only talking about one dimension, that's all. There's a variety of different dimensions. I don't think any one person can talk about all dimensions at the same time and still write one text. You can attempt to do it, but it's too rich. You end up having to do a shorthand, as it were. But it's this legacy of white supremacy that we have to come to terms with in relation to these market forces. And I would hope and pray that in our discussions that we keep in mind that we're talking about something so much bigger than us. We're talking about how do we keep alive radical democratic traditions of struggle, which means that we can bring critique to bear of homophobia and patriarchy, forms of xenophobia within black communities and within brown communities. And of course, this also holds for yellow and white and red as well. This is what makes it a robust and uninhibited discourse about veritas and about what it means to be human. And I simply say, let us proceed, because much is at stake, and at the same time, we can have a little intellectual fun in recognizing the ways in which we have been limited in our past and present, and the ways in which we can grow, develop, and mature as a result of manifesting that critical friendship and deep allegiance to democratic citizenship, both here and around the world. Thanks so much.